With contact with Bismarck having been regained, aboard Ark Royal, preparations were underway for a torpedo attack. Fuel tanks were filled and engines checked, while armourers fitted and primed torpedoes to the underside of the fuselages of the Swordfish. The torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 30 feet. As the Swordfish were armed, a plan of attack was formulated. All throughout the morning, and now into the afternoon, Renown remained to the east of Ark Royal, out of sight at times due to the mist. This was done in order to keep between Bismarck and France. If ordered to engage with Renown, Somerville planned to attack from astern and upwind so that Bismarck would be forced to turn, thus slowing her run to France. Attacking in such a manner also held advantages when making smoke. Renown was, however, of the same vintage as Hood, having been launched and commissioned in 1916. Like her sister ship HMS Repulse, Renown was less heavily armed than the Hood, carrying 6 15-inch guns, and was less heavily armoured, with 2.5 inches of deck armour and sporting 6-inch thick belt armour. The Admiralty, fearful of Somerville taking rash action and of history repeating itself, signalled the Commander-in-Chief of Force H that Renown was only to engage if King George V or Rodney were also engaged. With low clouds and rain squalls blowing across the seascape, it was recognised that it would be extremely easy for the shadowing aircraft to lose Bismarck once more. With Sheffield providing no useful purpose, the cruiser was detached from Force H by Somerville at 1:26 p.m. with orders to close and shadow Bismarck. Somerville thought that signal flags would be hoisted from the yardarm of his flagship to communicate the order to Sheffield. Such an action was standard practice because the signal would also be seen by those aboard Ark Royal, who would then know that Sheffield was being detached to make contact with the enemy. The chief yeoman of the signals did not use signal flags, however. Instead, he used a signal lamp, and no effort was made to specifically ensure that Ark Royal knew the whereabouts of Sheffield. In the bad weather, confusion of manoeuvring, and the preparations to arm, launch, and recover aircraft, no one on the bridge or in the flying operations centre of Ark Royal noticed the departure of Sheffield. Having received his orders from Somerville, Captain Charles Larkham, the commanding officer of Sheffield, ordered an increase in speed, whereupon the cruiser steamed through heavy seas at 28 knots to reach Bismarck. It was not a pleasant feeling on board. With wind blowing against the port bow, the ship tended to corkscrew as she ploughed her stern through the troughs, and then rose with green seas streaming off her forecastle. On the mess decks, plates and crockery smashed to the deck, where they mixed with seawater, scraps of paper, sodden magazines, books, and vomit. For those off watch, sleep was hard in coming, if not impossible. Besides this, everyone was keyed up, tense with excitement and foreboding. As Sheffield sailed on, the pilots on board Ark Royal were hastily informed of the orders for the mission by their squadron writers and told of their aircraft and order of takeoff. The attack was to be conducted by Swordfish drawn from 820 and 810 squadrons, and was to be led by Lieutenant Commander James Stuart Moore, the commanding officer of 820 Squadron. During the briefing, Stuart Moore was advised that the only vessel in the target area would be Bismarck. By 2 p.m., the Swordfish of 820 and 810 squadrons were ready. The weather, however, was no less favourable. The final order to launch the strike was received from Renown, and at 2:50 p.m. the first Swordfish, that, piloted by Stuart Moore, rumbled down the flight deck and took off. In a little over 5 minutes, 14 other Swordfish took off from the aircraft carrier. Once airborne, they formed up into their sub-flights before turning south to attack the enemy. Aboard King George V, Torpedo had been reading the signals from Somerville about recalling the Swordfish for arming as a strike force, their proposed launch time, and finally their successful takeoff. With the news that the Swordfish from Ark Royal had taken off successfully, there was now nothing to do but wait. It was an agonizing period, but the Commander-in-Chief would not be left brooding for long. One of the lookouts suddenly called out, "Ship bearing Red 70." All eyes on the bridge turned to the port beam, where, below the horizon, the unmistakable outline of the fighting top of a warship began to appear. Alarm bells were sounded, and the gun crews ran to their turrets before the 14-inch turrets themselves were swung round and the guns elevated as preparations were made to open fire. Thoughts raced. Could it be the Prinz Eugen? As seconds passed, more of the upper works came into view. There could be no mistaking the upper works. It was HMS Rodney. For Torvey and his staff, she was a wonderful sight. She had made no signals for over 30 hours, had been instructed to steer a variety of courses by the Admiralty, and now, when she was most needed, she had rendezvoused with King George V. An hour after taking off from Ark Royal, the Swordfish were closing in on the target area. From the cockpit of his aircraft, Stuart Moore glanced across to the Swordfish closest to his own aircraft, which was fitted with air-to-surface vessel radar. As he glanced across, he saw Sub-Lieutenant Norman Manley Cooper, who was charged with operating the radar set, waving in an effort to attract his attention. Manley Cooper indicated that the ship had been picked up on the radar set 20 miles away to starboard. To Stuart Moore, this was puzzling, as the position did not appear to correspond with the last known position of Bismarck. Nevertheless, having been told that Bismarck was the only vessel in the target area, he simply concluded that whatever the vessel was, it had to be German. The strike force therefore banked around to starboard. Through gaps in the cloud, Stuart Moore gained glimpses of the ship, which was clearly not a battleship, but a cruiser. It was therefore assumed that the vessel was the Prinz Eugen. At 3:30 p.m., the Swordfish descended through the clouds to the requisite height for dropping torpedoes, maintaining close formation as they did so. What was more, it was readily apparent that the strike force had caught their foe completely by surprise, for there was no anti-aircraft fire. As the aircraft neared sea level, Stuart Moore recognized the ship as the Sheffield. He waggled the wings of his Swordfish in an effort to indicate to the other pilots that something was wrong. Only 2 pilots got the idea and aborted their attacks, while the other 11 pressed on with their attacks with great swiftness. Aboard Sheffield, the crew watched the approaching Swordfish and were ordered to hold their fire. As the Swordfish began to release their torpedoes, a sickening realization came over the crew that they were being targeted in a case of mistaken identity. On the bridge, Captain Larkham called for full ahead and ordered that none of the ship's guns should open fire on the errant aircraft. The first torpedo was successfully combed, but immediately 3 others were sighted in the water off the starboard bow. One of the Swordfish had no sooner dropped its torpedo off the starboard bow of the cruiser when its crew recognized the identity of their foe. As the aircraft overflew the bow slowly at bridge height, its observer signaled by Aldous lamp, "Sorry for the kipper." This recognition of the error that was being made did nothing to soothe Larkham, who was purple with rage, his anger having been stoked by another Swordfish whose crew had sprayed the cruiser with machine gun fire as it overflew the ship. Disparaging comments flew around Sheffield's anti-aircraft crews, directed at the airmen. In all, Sheffield succeeded in avoiding 6 torpedoes. 2 of the torpedoes exploded on contact with the water, while 3 exploded in the wake of the cruiser, as the magnetic detonators that were fitted to the warheads proved rather temperamental. Having made their erroneous attack against Sheffield, the Swordfish once more formed up on Stuart Moore's aircraft for the flight back to Ark Royal. As the Swordfish flew back over the grey empty ocean, Stuart Moore was tapped on the shoulder by his air gunner, Petty Officer McCall. McCall handed him a signal which was headed most immediate. The signal advised, "Look out for Sheffield, which is in your vicinity." As they approached Ark Royal, the Swordfish were instructed to jettison any torpedoes that had not been launched. This order applied only to 3 aircraft, those which had not attacked Sheffield. Dropping their torpedoes well away from any British ships, they ran until they reached the limit of their range and exploded. As the aircrew landed and disembarked from their aircraft, they were shamefaced and headed to what one airman described with great understatement as an animated debrief. Below decks, Stuart Moore was greeted with a series of profuse apologies over the failure of Somerville's staff in renown to adequately inform Ark Royal that the Sheffield had been detached and sent ahead into the target area to commence shadowing the enemy. At his debriefing, Stuart Moore brought up the subject of the torpedoes, but nobody seemed interested in the tendency of the torpedoes with magnetic warheads to explode on contact with the sea. Instead, every effort was being put into planning a follow-up strike. Despite this, Stuart Moore persisted and found the ship's torpedo officer. After a discussion on the matter, they concluded that the mechanisms were faulty. They therefore sought permission to use contact warheads. The advantage of a torpedo fitted with a magnetic detonator lay in the ship's own magnetic field, which could detonate a torpedo that had been set to run under a vessel, where the blast would tear a hole in the keel. The explosive force of a contact warhead was somewhat diminished by comparison, as the charge was set off by the nose of the torpedo hitting the ship, whereupon much of the explosive force was dissipated into the sea and air. Stuart Moore and the torpedo officer believed that the torpedoes used in the attack against Sheffield had detonated on contact with the water and in the cruiser's wake because they had been trying to maintain their set depth in a heavy swell. With the sea conditions unlikely to change, it was decided that it would be better to revert to contact warheads. Stuart Moore's request was presented to Captain Maund, who, in turn, passed the request on to Somerville. A former torpedo specialist, Somerville instantly understood the predicament that had presented itself and gave his approval for the torpedoes used in the follow-up attack to be fitted with contact warheads. Sheffield, meanwhile, ploughed on in an effort to make contact with the Bismarck, and, at 5:40 p.m., sighted the Battleship. When she made contact, the British cruiser was a mere 12 miles from her quarry. As Sheffield began to edge round behind Bismarck, one of her sailors gazed at the German behemoth, expecting at any moment to see her guns belch fire as she opened fire. Like Norfolk and Suffolk before her, having made contact with the enemy, Sheffield began to send out a regular stream of reports to the Admiralty and to the fleet. Meanwhile, aboard King George V, the fuel situation was becoming increasingly critical. At 6 p.m., a visual signal was flashed to Rodney.
"Very probably we'll have to return for fuel at midnight. In case torpedo bombers get in another attack, it is most important you should be able to continue steaming at not less than 20 knots.
Dalrymple Hamilton now informed Torvey that Rodney would have to break off the pursuit at 8 a.m. the following morning in order to ensure that she could make it to a British port to refuel, with enough in reserve to take evasive action if attacked by the Luftwaffe. For the next few hours, fuel conservation became a top priority. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more updates, like and share. You can also help to support the channel at Patreon. Details are in the description box below. If you enjoyed this content, why not also check out my Substack page for more unique historical insights and articles. A link to the page is in the description box below.